and I am the founder of Entrepreneurs Collective. We are hosting the event this evening alongside Studio Graphene. But first, before we introduce you to Studio Graphene, let me just tell you a little bit more about Entrepreneurs Collective and myself. I am a founder, like many of you on this call. I was originally a lawyer. I decided to build a dating app, which was really tough. I didn't really know what I was doing. I made lots of mistakes, you know, I didn't know who to talk to. I wasn't sure where to source investment. And I looked to try and find community or try and get some guidance. And I really struggled. There was lots of bad events out there in London, and I felt it really lacked a sort of community to help me. So being an entrepreneur, I decided to set up my own. So this is how Entrepreneurs Collective came about, and our mission, which is essentially founders helping founders. So we believe that the best person to help other founders is people who have been on that journey with you or previously. So we try and bring together the best founders in London and across the UK to help each other to succeed. As a member of Entrepreneurs Collective, we do everything from pitch competitions. We will help review your pitch deck. We've got credits, everything from £10,000 of AWS credits that we can give away to over 50 other exclusive offers, access to workshops, networking events. Any pain point that a startup has, we try and fix, and that's what we try and do at EC. And I know these pain points because mostly I was trying to fix them to help myself. Thank you, Daniel. Next slide. Oh, okay, no, we're done. So we're going to hand over to Ritam and Studio Graphene. Just a few words from myself about Studio Graphene before I let them introduce themselves. Studio Graphene, you know, has been one of our partners for a long time. You know, we've worked on them on several projects, and they come very highly recommended. These guys are experts in their field, and they know what they're talking about when it comes to UX and UI. And what I really love about their workshops and working with them is they do it really well to change all the language from the UX, UI, and technical speak to really sort of plain English that helps understand for founders and newbies like myself. But without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Ritam. One last thing, if you've got any questions, please do feel free to put them into the chat. We normally do questions at the end, but if there's anything that's relevant, then Ritam may answer them as he goes through as well. So over to you, Ritam.
Perfect. Thanks, Mike. Jana's going to share her screen. Perfect. Hopefully everyone can see it.
Yeah, cool. Looking good.
So we have a bit of a cheesy title to this workshop that we're doing the second time, MVP to BVP. So your minimum viable product, but how do you make it your best viable product? And we will talk you through it. So next slide, please. So a bit of an agenda to run through. So we'll give you an intro to Studio Graphene, or I'll give you an intro quickly. Then Jana is going to talk you through why do startups fail. And then after that, we've got a bunch of almost themes that we think are quite relevant when you're trying to build as a founder your MVP, your first version of the digital product you're trying to bring to life. So it might feel a little disjointed, but really what we're trying to do is the three of us that are going to be presenting have kind of picked our favorite themes, the things that we feel passionate about, and we're going to talk about them. So I'm going to talk about testing your hypothesis, and following that, we'll talk about road mapping and user testing. How do you make data-driven decisions? How do you measure value from what you're creating? How do you create a strong foundation with your team? The power of writing great user stories, which Ed will run through, and the PM role in managing MVP, which Jana will go through. And then a bit of an epilogue at the end and questions. So that's our agenda. We'll kick off with an intro. So intro, I'm Ritam. I'm the founder of Studio Graphene. We've got Ed and Jana, who are product managers, who you'll hear from shortly. And they'll give you some great insights. So those are the presenters. A little bit about Studio Graphene. Thanks to Mike earlier for the kind words. Just a bit of context. We set up the business in 2014. And our premise was we didn't want innovation to be scary, expensive, or slow. And we felt that a lot of people talked about the ideas, but they didn't do much about them. So we wanted to be ideally the best place in the world to do something about the idea. We're now a team of 90 people spread across 4 countries, 3 time zones. And we spent the last 7 years standing kind of shoulder to shoulder with other founders in building over 150 ventures from ground up. So literally, I have an idea. What do I do next? Next slide, please. So in terms of our capability, we have the ability to design, build, and launch digital products. We tend to use existing technology. So we always say, we're not trying to invent new technology per se. We're not trying to write new AI algorithms, but what we're trying to do is invent new ways of using existing technology, because we think there's a huge opportunity to use existing digital capability to build amazing digital products and bring utility to an individual. So we have UX, UI designers, we have product managers, we have app developers, back-end engineers, front-end engineers on web, quality assurance analysts, etc., etc. Everything you need to have a rock star team to deliver your innovation or the digital product you're trying to bring to life. So that's a little bit about us. Always happy to take questions in case you want to know more about us. But we'll now launch into our workshop. And the first topic we're going to talk about is why startups fail.
Thank you. Thank you, Ritam. Good evening, everyone. So before we proceed with tips, tricks, and advices on how to build a successful MVP, I would like us to discuss the main reasons why startups fail. And I want to share a link with you in Zoom chat, and please take 1 minute to answer this question and choose the main reason why do you think startups fail. So just give me a second, and yeah, here's a link. Let me know if it doesn't work for someone. And let's give everyone a minute to answer, and then we can see results and discuss. Okay, so I will show you what the results are at the moment. We see who is winning. Let's give everyone 30 more seconds to answer.
So actually, whilst everyone's voting, I'll answer one question sneakily. So Daryl asked, this is purely for digital products. I'd say what we're talking about, the principles apply to any blank canvas creation of a basic business or product. But yes, this is very much digital product focused. So there is a digital product lean to it, I'd say, for 60–70% of what we're going to talk about.
All right, so I will freeze, log the voting. So here are the results. So 30% are for no market need, then not right team and run out of cash, and then the other options, which is quite interesting to see. So I will show you the actual results in a moment. So actual results is, first one is no market need, and it's quite interesting to see because we had a similar presentation like half a year ago, and there was a very low percentage of people who actually guessed that the top reason why startups fail is a market reason, no market need, and then run out of cash, know the right team, and etc. etc. So yeah, very interesting. So the next slide is to you, Ritam.
Brilliant. So I'm going to talk about hypothesis testing. And I think someone in the chat said building a product with lots of unverified assumptions, and this is really about assumptions. So next slide, please. So hypothesis testing, and why I keep obsessing over it really is, and I put in this kind of slightly boring school statistics diagram about hypothesis testing. And this is not about you measuring the likelihood of your H0 or H1 hypothesis within 2 standard deviations of the mean, but it's the same concept. And essentially, what ends up happening, and why I feel so strongly about this, in my experience, when most founders come to us with a brief, there is inevitably some level of detail around what they think the product feature should be, what it should look like, but a huge level of detail. And what we end up trying to push for is to take a step back. What is the user need? And what are your assumptions around that user need? And to validate those assumptions. And it's a process that we struggled with, but we still find it very constructive and we really push for it, because what we find is that actually everyone can align around that single point of truth. So even if you think you know everything, we work with startup founders who know the industry inside out, and they should know everything. And over the years, when we've just gone along and kind of built the specification that they've assumed is the right specification and launched it, it's been quite painful for them to then learn from real user feedback and rebuild it. The point that I think the other way of looking at hypothesis testing is to take the architect's analogy. So if you look at, you're trying to build a building, you might sketch it and then you might throw away that drawing. That's not so painful. You might then create a model of it and you might throw it away because you realize that your assumptions were incorrect. That's a little bit more painful. But if you actually build the building and throw it away, that's way more painful. So if you want to build the best viable product or the best value product, you really have to test your hypothesis. And you need to do that, you need to first accept that actually everything that all your assumptions are guesses. They're not validated. So the first step is to validate them. Next slide, please. So a lot of people think of, and it's interesting when voted, I think about a third of people said it's to do with money. And obviously research has shown that yes, money is a big factor and it is in the top 3, but running out of cash is not the biggest reasons why products fail. I think it's assumptions that they make. I think I've put in 3 examples of Jawbone, the Sports, and Juicero, all of which raised hundreds of millions, one of which raised over $1 billion. I think my favorite example is Juicero. I just find it too funny, and actually it's not even really a digital product. But Juicero raised hundreds of millions, in Silicon Valley based, very famous kind of startup. And I guess the way they were the assumption was that someone would want an espresso version of a juicing machine. And so they kind of replicated espresso for juicing machine. That was that the utility that juicing machine provided was something that people wanted. There was a user need for it. And so they created this machine and they started shipping these expensive juicing bags. And what people found was a juicing machine doesn't quite work like an espresso machine. B, people didn't really see the value in just buying a machine that took a bag and pressed it. They could literally do it with their own hands. And so their assumptions were incorrect. So even though they had loads of money, they failed miserably because of their assumptions being incorrect. If they had tested the hypothesis or a bunch of hypotheses that they would have saved hundreds of millions, potentially even stood a chance of pivoting and becoming successful. Again, the Sports made a lot of assumptions around the Asian market in terms of how they'd match demand to what viewing rights they could get. Again, the assumptions weren't validated. Jawbone, around the variety of devices, they spent loads on putting devices out there or bits of hardware out there that there wasn't a user need. They didn't actually look at the nuances that they needed to cater to. So I think the most entertaining example is Juicero. So that's critical, that you need to be able to test your hypothesis. It's not about just raising loads of money. Next, please. There's a lot of quotes about learning as fast as you can. I really cannot emphasize this enough. As a startup, yes, money is important, etc. But we work with founders who, for them, in so many ways, it's a bit of a race against time. They've told their investors to raise money that they'll hit certain metrics in a certain time frame. They have a certain runway in terms of cash, etc. It's all about speed. But the key is you're going to learn. Question is, do you waste 5 years learning? Do you waste 2 years learning? Do you waste a year learning? Do you waste a day learning? The faster you learn, the more likely you are to succeed. And the more likely you are to pivot, adapt, whatever you need to hit your product market fit. race as fast as you can to learn, hit that product market fit, spend less, get more out of each small step that you take. So yeah, that's one key topic. The next one. So Jana is going to play the Dropbox video in a second.
Should I play?
Yeah. No, I was just going to say one thing before you play it. But no, go to the Dropbox slide. That's fine. I was just going to say that I'm going to give a couple of examples of how you can learn fast. And we talked about the juicing machine example, but now we're going to talk about Dropbox, which is the other extreme. So Jana's just going to play a video which Dropbox created to test demand. They didn't create products; they created a video to test demand. So this is the other extreme of someone trying to learn as fast as one can, and as you've seen, they've been successful. So just quickly, if you can play the video, that would be super helpful.
You've been there. You're about to buy lunch and realize your wallet is in your other pants. Or maybe you left your keys at home. The problem is organization. You need one place for everything, like a magic pocket. Putting something in the magic pocket means it's always there, no matter what you wear or where you are. The same thing is true for computers. If you have more than one, keeping track of all of your files can be a pain. Solving this problem is one of the big ideas behind Dropbox. It's like a magic pocket, a single, secure place for all of your stuff. Let's meet Josh, who is preparing for a big trip to Africa. Right now, all of his trip info is spread across his laptop, desktop, and phone. He needs to consolidate it all and is tired of having to email files to himself or move them around with a USB drive. Then he found Dropbox, which creates a new kind of folder on his computers. These folders work hard to be exactly alike, even across Macs and PCs. By adding his itinerary to his laptop Dropbox, he can be sure the same file will show up in his desktop Dropbox and even on his phone. The same thing happens when he saves a document in a Dropbox folder. The document gets updated across all of his Dropboxes. But it's not just his computers. The Dropbox website also works to be exactly like his other Dropboxes. Anything he puts in Dropbox is available on the website automatically. This way, if his Jeep takes a dive and his computer is ruined, he can still get to his files on the Dropbox website, where they're always backed up. As it turns out, Josh's Safari was a success, and his laptop made it home with lots of videos and photos to share. Instead of emailing everything, he just shared a Dropbox folder with his mom, so she could get copies of photos she wants to frame. Because it worked so well for travel, Josh made Dropbox the home for all of his stuff, so it's accessible anytime, wherever he goes. Whether you're traveling the world, running a business, or simply organizing your life, Dropbox means you can stop worrying about managing files and backups and get on with your next adventure. You can download Dropbox now at Dropbox.com.
So at this stage, Dropbox was just a prototype. Of course, a lot of people said they want to download Dropbox, and then they realized they want something. But they tested demand with a video. And I think what I find amazing about this is obviously Dropbox came years and years and years ago. And surely, seeing this over 15 years ago, you can learn from it. But we see startups in 2021 making the same mistake, where they don't test the product market fit or user need like Dropbox did. And it's just, it's incredible. Next slide, please. Lots of people might have seen what people call Uber Cab, obviously now called Uber, but Uber Cab presentation, investor presentation. It's online. You can search for it. You can get it, and it's a long deck. You can read through it in your own time. But this is their first pitch deck, and the reason I've picked this slide is I just find it quite funny because they talk about something like, well, progress to date, iPhone dev license. Well, everyone knows that getting a license for the App Store, developer licenses, I think it costs $70. It's reasonably easy. But bank account and PayPal account created, like really basic stuff. And this is Uber in their first pitch deck, so it shows you how basic and bare bones they were in validating the concept. But when you look at the last line, which is next, what are they going to do? They're going to buy 3 cars, develop an app, do a demo, raise a few million, small office. Just make it sound so easy. But the irony is they're going super small, no big ambition, not going to have thousands of cars, etc. Reasonably basic. I just think, again, This is years and years ago. Surely startups in 2021 should be learning from examples like this. You can go super basic to make sure that you make your MVP successful. All right, next. And that is it. Over to you, Yana. Or is it
No,
Ed?
it's to Ed.
Ed, over to you.
Yeah, so if we go on to the next slide, Yana. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is roadmaps. Now, ironically, it's been quite a popular sort of 7 months of roadmaps, as I think every time any of us have watched the news or read a newspaper, you've probably seen the word roadmap written quite a lot. But they can be a really, really powerful tool in aligning all of your stakeholders, both internal and externally, as to your plan to build your MVP. It allows you to really map out your plan to launch visually. But the big thing is that not to be afraid to have different versions of your roadmap. So a really good example of this is something like the video games industry. They might have a roadmap that they release to the public, which just outlines really high level features and an estimated go live date. But that will be a different roadmap to the one they'll use maybe to the senior management, and then a different one than what they'll use for the engineers internally. So it could be a really powerful tool. And I think it's one of those things that you can always adjust to make sure that the people you're showing it to can get the most out of it. Again, it allows you to see long-term delivery plans and also make sure that your roadmap is coming from user-focused sources. You've validated your hypothesis and you think, you can build your roadmap out of features and ideas that you think will continue to work towards that hypothesis. Next slide, please, Yana. So roadmaps are great, but there are a couple of things to be careful of when you're building your roadmap. The first one is estimations. So estimations can often be arbitrary, like especially if they're a long way ahead. There might be a long time between the time you're estimating and the time you're building. And in that time, things might change for the good and for the bad. Like there might be new technology that makes things faster, but there might also be things you learn about your business or your industry that might make things slower. So the further away things are, just be mindful that things might take longer or shorter than you think. And of course, the other thing to make sure you factor in is making sure that you have time to research and validate what you're building. It's important that you're always reviewing what you're putting on your roadmap and making sure that it's actually accurate for what you're looking at. Another pitfall to try and avoid is to make sure that they're not problem focused. You've got to make sure that you're solving your problems for your customers or your users, and if you're not doing that, then this kind of foundation for your product. You've also got to make sure that you leave room for change. Again, as you're learning, as you're building and doing user testing, which we'll come on to, you'll find out more things about your product and how your customers use it, and that can really help you in making sure that your product has the right fit for its market. So if you want to move on, Jan. Thank you. So one of the things that I've used in the past, one of the things I could suggest is making sure you keep your roadmap rooted in the problems you're trying to solve, and similarly to the hypotheses you're trying to test. A problem-focused roadmap allows you to ensure that the work you're doing is rooted in the client's need and not just the technical deliverable. It's quite easy to just say we're going to build this and build this and build this, but maybe it's worth seeing, validating why you're building those things. It also means that you can use metrics like, OKRs to track your progress against those problems. Like if you've seen, for example, that users are dropping off at a particular point in an onboarding flow, you can use that as a measuring stick for a change in the user flow, and then you can see if more people are registering. A big example of this that I'm sure we've all come across is the Windows 8 example. It's quite notable that the engineers built what they could, but maybe not what they should. And if they'd have maybe done more user testing or kept their delivery focused in the problem, they would have learned a bunch, and maybe would have had something like Windows 10 a little bit earlier than what we eventually got. Sorry, Jan, next slide, please. So one way of making sure that you're validating all the way through is user testing. So as Ritam just mentioned, Dropbox didn't really have a product and they were already user testing. It allows you to evaluate your product or idea and ensuring that what you're creating is catering for the people you're creating it for. It can happen when you've built your MVP, but it could start way earlier. For example, right at the start when you've got concepts or even paper prototypes, maybe when you're at the design stage, when you've got some high fidelity prototypes, you can give it to people, ask them, where would you go with this? What do you think you could achieve on this page? Those kind of questions. Or of course, when you go live. So there's a million tools out there to see what people do when they land on your website or your app. And it's all really, really powerful. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on. But in terms of tips, I think Britam and Jana will probably agree that sometimes when it comes to user testing, both for the tester and the testee, you can get a bit overwhelmed. So I think it's important that you establish what you're trying to test. Asking someone to go, how do you think my app is maybe a little bit too broad and then maybe a little bit overwhelming. So maybe try and focus in on like really core things you're maybe trying to improve or that you've seen aren't functioning in the way that you'd like them to. Similarly, keep it simple. It might be really tempting to test everything at once, but again, you might not get those insights that you would get if you focused on particular areas or particular pieces of functionality, and you might get some really important things. Onboarding flows are a perfect example. If there are issues with that, then people don't join your platform. So that's the kind of prime example of where user testing can really help you. And the final one, which I know sounds a bit strange, but look at what users do, not always what they say. Especially if we're sitting with them, there is a chance that they might think they're saying the thing that you want them to say, which in a way isn't what you want them to say. What you want them to show you or tell you is maybe some of the problems. But if you in some way can measure what they're doing, so for an example, something like Hotjar, you can see track their eyes or their clicks or heat maps and stuff, and you can see exactly where a user is drawn on particular pages. And it's a really, really useful way of being able to see exactly how users are interacting with your product or your app or your website. And you get data, you get metrics, so you can make a change and then test it again. And then you go, okay, is it better or worse than the first time the users saw it? And you can keep factoring that into your roadmap.
Thanks, Ed. So now it's my turn to speak about data-driven decisions. And usually a good example is that you all know what our e-commerce sites are, and usually e-commerce sites use data to drive profits and sales. If you ever shopped on Amazon, I hope you all know what Amazon is. You probably received a product recommendation while visiting the Amazon, or you got an email as a follow-up from Amazon. This is an example of data-driven business decision. So not sure if you all know how Amazon started, but it actually started as a bookstore. It was their MVP. So on the top right corner, you can see the first version of Amazon launched as a bookstore. And then it evolved into this website. I think it's like end or mid 90s, but it was all about bookstores selling books. Not that much digital at that point of time, but they used data, they analyzed, and they evolved into the Amazon that we know now. So this is probably very similar to what you have seen on Amazon, like with lots of recommendation, trends, and related items. So Amazon bases its recommendation on what customers have bought in the past. The items in their visual shopping cart, what items customer has ranked or reviewed after purchase, or what product the customer have reviewed when visiting the site. Amazon also use different metrics such as click-through rate, open rates, opt-out rates for further to decide what recommendation to recommend to end users. And basically by integrating recommendation into nearly every aspect of Amazon, it's like all over the whole Amazon platform, they realized that the company found that the product recommendation in fact do drive sales and increase the bottom line for the company. So I want just to share with you 5 reasons why companies should be data-driven. And the reason one is basically you don't have to make a decision in the dark anymore. A person in intuition is not a feasible yardstick for making decisions. And basically it helps company in terms of like decision making. Second reason is all about setting unrealistic targets and putting unnecessary pressure on employees is a big setback for companies. By leveraging data, a data-driven company can set business goals that are both ambitious and reachable. The reason 3 is about that the goal of every company is to reach business success, and being data-driven helps a business hit their goals. The reason number 4 is about that the biggest drawback of any company is not being aware of feasibility of the products and services offered by the company. And reason 5 is that the power of the data is not limited to optimizing business alone. By tracking the individual performance of employees, it helps employees identify process gaps and rework on their management practices. And this is probably for you, Ritam, your slides.
Yep. All right, so I'm going to talk about 3 things that I've kind of tied together, and it may not make sense until we go through it, but how do you measure value? And someone in chat asked about, roadmap prioritization. I think it's got a lot to do with value. How do you build a good foundation? Because most people, to go from your MVP to BVP, you want to build a strong foundation. And of course, every startup is constrained by the team, resources, etc. that they have. So I wanted to try and kind of explain how it all fits together. Next slide, please. So obviously, it's a funny meme, but just bought a domain for my startup. So I guess things are getting serious. I've noticed like a lot of founders, one of the things they'll say is they're like, hey, I've just, I've chosen my name, I bought the domain, and they're super excited. That is probably the most exciting part. And then obviously the hard work starts. But the team and resources you have available is something you have to be very cognizant of, right? We said that it's not just about funding, etc., but you have to pair your ambition and align it with what you have available to you. Because if you try and overshoot based on what you have available, you may not get to your end goal. You may not give yourself that full shot because you'll fall halfway. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to talk about how do you measure value and how do you decide what you should focus on. If you Google it, there's loads of suggestions, there are loads of formulas and weightings, etc., that you can use. But I thought, okay, this is actually one of the things that will come up when you Google it is a diagram such as this. There are essentially 4 components that you have when you're trying to prioritize your roadmap. What is the effort required to do a task? And Ed talked earlier about estimations. It's super difficult to estimate things, but roughly what's the effort? Something might be less effort but high cost. Classic example is a big plugin that you want to use, which is expensive. But what's the cost? That's a factor. What's the value? So by value, I mean what's the utility you're giving to the user? And ideally, that value has been tested, and your hypothesis around that value has been tested. What's the risk? What's the chances that you'll build that feature and the user may not use it? How sure are you that the user will use it, or not even whether they'll use it, but there'll be an uptake? And so these are 4 things you need to think about, in my opinion, when you're prioritizing a feature. For instance, if something is low cost, gives a lot of value, even if it's a lot of effort, but the risk is low, I would prioritize it. And that should be kind of go on top on your roadmap. If something's a lot of effort and really expensive and highly risky, but delivers a lot of value, you need to investigate it and find out and potentially try and reduce the risk. The thing that you really want to avoid is people think, oh, this is less effort, so I should do it. But actually, no, if it's high cost, delivers low value and high risk, just avoid it. And then the thing that will be there in your backlog is low risk, it's a small feature, it's easy, delivers a little bit of value, reasonably cheap. And that's something you need to always keep in your product roadmap or prioritization. Next slide, please. The other thing that I find quite interesting is impact mapping. So if you Google it on Amazon, you can buy the book. It's not very long. I'm not very good at reading long books. And if you're like me, then you'll like this because it's a very thin book. I can't remember, maybe 30, 40 pages. You can read about it. There's stuff online. There is, I think, a Miro board template for drawing an impact map, etc. But essentially, at its base level, what an impact map is trying to do is to make sure that your MVP is cohesive, or really at any point in your product lifecycle, it's cohesive. So you're doing something for a purpose. You're not just randomly thought of features, and there is some structure to it. There is some method to the madness. And it starts with talking about a goal. What are you trying to achieve with your goal? So let's say you're a restaurant and you want to have a digital ordering interface. Your goal is that users can come in and understand how to use that ordering interface. Your actors are your serving staff, your the customers that are coming in, the chefs, etc. The impact you want to achieve, let's say taking the actor as the customer and the goal is understanding things properly, is that they can learn how to use the digital ordering interface. Okay, great. So you know the impact, you know it's for the customer, you know the goal. Okay, what are the deliverables? The deliverables are that you need to perhaps create a tutorial that they can view on the interface. And actually what comes after that, and Ed will talk about it, is user stories. Then you can build user stories around the deliverables. But an impact map is really to make sure that you're thinking about everything as a cohesive unit, and you're achieving your goals. You're not just randomly building features, and you're always keeping at the back of your mind, okay, this is a team, this is a resources. Can I hit these goals? So you're mapping the deliverables back to your goals and making sure you have the resources to hit those deliverables. Next slide, please. All right, so kind of trying to bring it all together, hopefully to make it make sense. These are, I think, the foundational elements to build the best possible MVP, also known as your best viable product. We talked earlier as the need, you need to make sure there's a product need, there's a market need, a customer need, whatever you want to call it, right? It's research has shown that's the most important thing. It's the obvious thing that you need to focus on. Capital is important, and it's not necessarily how much you raise, but it's about the capital being proportionate to what you're trying to do. So, if you want to build a small app, you might need X amount. If you want to build a big app, you might need X amount. So it needs to be proportionate. The team needs to work together. It needs to have the skill sets that are needed to build your product. The last bit, which is contentious, I think, but I've put it in there, is technology. And I believe that the technology should be defensible. It's that time and time again, we work with startups that like chucking in, they'll be like, I want to build this product that's going to have AI, machine learning, AR, VR, etc., right? Robotic process automation, blah, blah, blah. But really, like, you need to align the technology to what the product need is, to what capital you have, what team you have. And it needs to be defensible. It needs to be something you can maintain. It needs to be realistic. So actually the technology, and obviously we're technologists, so we believe in it. It really needs to match with the capital you have, with the team you have, with the product need, rather than just loads of buzzwords. And making sure what you build is something that's robust and scalable. Next slide, please. All right, over to Ed.
Yeah, so as Rita mentioned earlier, one of the ways you can start to go from these kind of high-level hypotheses is to start to be able to define what you're wanting to build is by using user stories. They follow a very sort of simple format, but which is, as I put in the slide, is as a I can, so that. And what they allow us to do is articulate how something delivers value directly to the user. It's like a map of what a user is doing so they can achieve a certain thing. But they also have happened to become the backbone of agile product development, and you'll see them used all over product development across all levels. And one of the things that I personally think is super powerful about them is that at every level of your product, whether you're a product manager, a marketer, an engineer, a founder, whoever is interacting with their user story, the user is always in the eye line of what you're doing. So if a feature you've built doesn't meet a higher level user story, you probably built it wrong. So it just allows you to kind of keep that scope in the front of your mind at all times. And that you'll work with teams, for example, when you're planning in more detail, and I think Jana will come on to planning as well, but to define more technical requirements. But what this means is that you can start to define at a product level what you're looking to achieve, and making sure that the user is always the focus. And I've put a quote here that story is quite cheesy, I'm sorry, but story is the oldest way of passing along information. And there is some truth in that. It's an easy way, writing user stories is an easy way of communicating what you're looking for, or on behalf of the user, what they're looking for, in a way that will be transferable and understandable to anyone in your team. And I've put a cave painting picture on here because some would argue that's quite an early version of a user story of someone, sort of pointing out how they would hunt for animals, I suppose. But yeah, there you go. Next slide.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, so PM role in MVP development. When you start your company, the founder usually acts as a product manager in the beginning. So what is PM's role in MVP development? Firstly, it's all about planning and prioritization, and the focus of saying no to features that are not critical for the MVP. Proper planning and prioritization can save time and budget for the company. For some projects, I personally spent like 1 to 3 days with dev team on planning, and for others, it can take up to 1 full week, just full focus, like full time, full day to do proper planning and design review. The next thing is to walk through failures and successes. And it's important to understand that things will fail. Something won't work as you planned, but when you are prepared for it, you just need to make sure that you and the team build some sort of like a mindset in the teams that you learn from failures. With my team, whenever we have any failure, I make sure that we have a retrospective meeting, and that ends with action items, assignees, and follow-up dates to make sure that we won't be fixing the same issue again, or we won't be doing the same mistake over and over again. And to opposite to failures, it's all about celebrating success, which is super important to celebrate small achievements, big achievements, some improvements and suggestions from the team. It will motivate the team. It will basically help for the team to be the best they can. With Studio Graphene team, we're using a small Slack plugin called Taco Rewards. So basically, whenever a team succeeds in something, we share tacos. It's a small gesture, but actually it's quite a nice thing to share with everyone and celebrate success. And basically it helps to lift up the team spirit. The next thing is, as a PM, you should be on top of latest trends in different domains, such as business, technology, user experience, in order to guide the team in right decisions. And by being on top of latest trends in all these different domains, you will be able to take right decisions to develop your company. And the last thing, basically in the end of day, the most important thing is to have proper communication and clear communication within the team. Here are a few examples what we use at Studio Graphene to create transparency in terms of communication, so everyone are aware on why and what we are doing. Yeah, I think it's also important that product managers set up this clarity within the team. And yeah, probably you know most of these tools. Maybe Miro is something that you are not that familiar. It's basically whiteboard for collaboration, which is very helpful and useful during remote work, but other tools might be very familiar to you. So now to epilogue. Oh, sorry.
No worries. These are just two nice inspirational quotes I thought we'd share before we close the presentation and take questions. I think the Henry Ford one again, I think both of these you might have heard of, but I love this. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. I think the reason for saying this is, we've talked a lot about user testing, ask the user, but really you need to back yourself, be confident. If you see a market need, persevere in it. And then again, just the other extreme, Steve Jobs, it's really hard to design products by focus group. A lot of times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. And that's where we really believe in the idea of not, and I think Ed touched upon it in terms of user testing, it's don't always just believe what someone says, see what they do. We've used tools like Hotjar, etc., to see what people do, and it's quite an eye-opening experience. So just two quotes to share, and I think now we move to questions. Perfect. Not sure how we should run questions, Mike or Daniel.
I think Farouk wants to ask a question before you go to those from the chat.
Okay, Farouk, over to you.
Thank you, Ritam, Yana, and Ed. I'm happy to write my question if it's easier for you guys, or I'm happy to ask it as well.
No, you can just ask.
Okay, so I wanted to get your opinion on how to minimize the risk when interpreting data once you think that you have validated. And I actually want to use the video that you use as an example in the example that I'm trying to get to. So Dropbox video, I think it's a wonderful video and it shows you how basic they were to start with. But essentially, they defined the problem, but then the solution is essentially asking the user to imagine the future and then what action would they take in the future, which is something that was put to me saying, you know, using that kind of basis isn't a really great way to validate anything. However, you used it as a prime example of how Dropbox validated their product. But the critique would be, in this case, is that they were asking people to imagine something that didn't exist, then imagine themselves using that product that still doesn't exist. So like predicting the future within the future, which, as I'm sure you're aware, there's inherent risks of. So just to underline the question, how do you minimize the pitfalls or the risks in the data that you have collected of what you consider is your validation?
Very good question. Very good question. And something actually, ironically, I've thought about quite a bit. So this is my view on it. Everyone might have different points of view, but I always think it's, what is it that you're trying to validate that you have to first decide, and at what level is that validation, right? So, and that's why, depending on that level of validation, you determine what level of data you need. So I'll try and explain what my point is. Dropbox was trying to validate whether there's a user need for a product such as Dropbox, not specific nuances associated with that product. So that video was just, you know, to say what people say I want it, right? And then the other extreme is we've been talking to someone about data layers in products, and that's a very kind of detailed level, right? Where you are looking at the analytics in a detailed way. For that, you need enough users, enough product data. So you kind of start with, you know, is there generally a product need? Okay, well, what are the specific bits of functions that products need? And if you look at, you know, once you've got the likes of an Uber or Airbnb, they'll be using, you know, millions of users worth of data to make small tweaks to the product, just because they've got so many users and so much data. So I think it depends on what level that you're trying to validate something at. High level, is there a general need for this product? To, you know, do I need to tweak the small thing in the product? And as startups grow and they get more users, at least with the founders we've worked with, we've realized that you start to make more and more granular decisions because you have more and more data and more detail, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Thank you, Farouk.
Cool.
The next question is from Bala, who asked, how do you bring in pricing early on the customer development? Bala, if you want, you can jump in and give more details if you want.
Sure. Hi, guys. Yeah, so I'm actually working on just a bit of context on this one. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay. So I'm working on a payments kind of product for the logistics and construction sector in India, and I've started doing a lot of user interviews over the last couple of months. There's been a good interest in what we're trying to find out. But we are kind of looking at how can we bring in a bit of pricing so people can, so when we actually launch the MVP, we are kind of sure of what price point we can actually pitch it to. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in pricing, but nearly all the founders we work with start with some kind of free product and then they want to add a paywall to it. And it's, I think, the scariest part of the journey for them, because they're afraid that there will be a huge amount of user drop off. So it's a question of being able to test, you know, what price point people will pay. But I think, or at least what I found, the harder question is not necessarily what people will pay, but at what point they'll be willing to go past that paywall and pay for something. And I think that bit of testing tends to, at least with the founders we work with, comes after they've built a bit of a community of users with the free version. And then they start to ask, what is it that you want and what features would you pay for? And it's done through user engagement of an existing community. I've not necessarily seen it. I think it's possible, but I've just not seen it being tested or validated with users before there's a product, if that makes sense. But I think
so I've actually seen
actually,
it.
Mike, you'll know better on this.
Yeah, well, I think some of the things that I've seen some of our members do is things like, for instance, you can always put a Facebook advert up or a Google ad and just do 4 different price points. And if no one's clicking on the advert where it's $15.99 for X service, then probably you're not going to get any conversions. A little bit like the Dropbox, right? You don't actually have to have the product to see them clicking through to your website. You can put the proposition in 2 sentences, stick it on an advert, put £10 behind it under 4 different adverts, and then see which one converts at the highest. If one advert is selling at £50 and you get a 10% conversion, but you start trying to sell it at £25, but you get 10 times more, then actually maybe £25 is a better price.
That's a really good point, because I'm running a lot of Facebook ads.
But focus groups as well, super good. Or even general surveys, like, put out the proposition and then just ask people, what would you be prepared to pay? And try and get it out and send it out to some people, or just do a combination of the 3 and just try and get as many information points as possible.
Cool, thank you, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Next question.
Zafar, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. So my question is, it builds a little bit on what Farouk mentioned here about risks. So I work, I'm a university professor, and I'm trying to get into ed tech. Now, one factor that I want to consider in terms of risk is how willing, even if there's a market need, for example, right? What about conversion to that product? So when I started building my product last year, when we were hit by the pandemic as a result of moving to remote working environments, so we needed to create something, a better workspace for students to work in. But I saw a lot of resistance from instructors, right, to move on to that. Maybe it was, even though the tools existed, we had licensing from things like Microsoft Teams or Slack or whatever, but there was a lot of resistance in terms of moving to another tool or technology. And they wanted to stick to, for example, WhatsApp to communicate with larger groups or instructors, and there was 20 WhatsApp groups going on. So how do you address that when there exists a market need that you can identify, but there is a reluctance or a hesitation to shift? Exactly.
Yeah, and I'll use another example which always kind of baffles me. But we're in 2021. But if you were to look at how many people use paper, right, to do things, and how we're not a paperless society, is unbelievable. Like, you think of how easy it is to use DocuSign or electronic contracts, but still, during the pandemic, one of the hardest parts was, obviously, I run a business and I have to constantly sign stuff, and the amount of hassle I had to go through to use paper-based contracts is huge. So I think conversion in any kind of digital product and getting people away from what they're used to when something new is going to be hard. But I think at least what I've seen in terms of products where we've seen someone kind of come up with something better than what's there in the market, you almost have to find a way to find that hook. Like, what is that one thing that will make people want to use and convert to your product, and really focus on that, rather than kind of, here are 10 features you can use in my product better. It's like, what's that one hook that's really going to pique their interest and for them to see immediate utility from when they convert? And I think if you can focus on that and these ways of focus on that, you're likely to get conversion. What's the attraction essentially? What is, at the end of the day, people see there as the barrier to conversion as an effort to convert. So you have to somehow make the attraction of that conversion be construed as being higher than the effort to convert.
Just one more thing. Is there a way that you can analyze that risk when you are in your development stage or testing stage or something? Can you quantify that risk?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Like, a lot of people say, like, one of the formulas people use is like, what is the projected impact of what you're building? What is the confidence it will succeed? And then divide that by your effort to implement it. Like, that's one of there are all these like risk assessment formulas, right? it's very hard to, like there are all these formulas, but truly, because then you have to say, okay, I have to be able to measure the projected impact. I have to measure the confidence levels. I have to measure the effort to implement, but you can sort of weigh it during the development stage. But it, I think, comes back to how can you test it with the least amount of effort. I think that's the real way of de-risking it. So I think, you know, doing it through surveys, through focus groups, user testing, ads, whatever it might be, but how can you, before you go and build a feature that you expect people to convert to, how can you test it, right? And I think that's truly how you de-risk it, is by getting that early user feedback.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
Julia McMillan, do you want to ask your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I asked a question about code because I've now got an MVP. I've got a tech team in India, and I decided to do native code, iOS and Android. But if I was to do it again, I probably wouldn't, because it's such a bore to have to do iOS and then repeat an Android. So would you recommend using a framework to start off, and then once you've got traction, splitting it into 2 different products for native code?
It's a very good question. It's something we always try and question internally within Studio Graphene. So we, to kind of get around it, what we did was we said, we don't want to be beholden to engineering preferences. So every single mobile engineer in our team is a native developer in a particular language. So let's say there'll be an iOS specialist and they'll write Swift, but they'll also know a hybrid language, let's say React Native. So we can always offer both options. There are, as always, advantages and disadvantages. There's also, just to complicate matters further, there's also, I don't know if you're familiar with progressive web apps, but you can also have progressive web apps, which then you can make downloadable to the App Store. So there's actually 3 options. There's native, there's something like React Native or Flutter, which are languages which are hybrid. You write in one language, but it creates iOS and Android apps. But there's also progressive web apps, which is essentially like a responsive web app, which you can put a wrapper around and push to the mobile app store. And I think it comes back to what a couple of things. One is, early on in the presentation, we talked about team and resources. So I think it comes a lot to do with team and resources, right? So hypothetically, if you wanted to take the development in-house and you wanted just one mobile developer, it's very unlikely that you'll find a mobile developer who's an iOS specialist and an Android specialist. You'll have 2 unique teams. So if that's a priority, I would have gone down the hybrid route, like React Native. If you were doing something that was very specific, you know, sometimes when you're working with, let's say, a bank, like a very specific security feature, they will want you to build, or they will say that you have to build a native application. So I would start with kind of assessing everything, but if you don't need a pure play native application, I would not build a pure play native application. I would build something like React Native or Flutter, so it's hybrid. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, and I've also realized, talking to other founders, that actually it's quite common to, once you've got traction, to rebuild it anyway.
Absolutely, you're constantly rebuilding a product. The one you can, if you want to read more about this topic, there's a very, I think it's on Medium, but there's a very good article if you Google about Airbnb. So Airbnb was one of the famous startups that was a unicorn, because everyone said, oh, well, no real successful startup, no billion-dollar or unicorn startup builds through something like React Native. They always build natively, but Airbnb have written an amazing article about their journey from React Native to native, about why they built with React Native, why it worked for them then, and how they transitioned to native. So if you have a look, you'll be able to find that article, and it's quite interesting.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay, and do you have Musab here for his question about MVP?
Sorry, should I go on video as well?
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, so my question was, I've almost completed my MVP, and like I said in the question, I consider my ugly babies kinda, where the screens need to be redesigned, right? I've already got someone who kind of who's done some of the redesign, but obviously implementing the design is something different. So I wanted to know how accurate is the advice of, you know, if you're not embarrassed by your product, and if you're not embarrassed by your product that you've shipped too late, like how accurate is that advice? And what have you guys seen in terms of some of the, I guess, some of the startups you've worked with?
Yeah. So that statement was by Reid Hoffman, right? Who's the
Yeah.
founder of LinkedIn. If you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product you've launched too late. I used to actually use that quote a lot. Because obviously we have loads of founders coming through. They're like, we have all this we want to build and we have this budget, and we say this. I agree and disagree with that advice. I agree when it comes to limiting your features. So you should be embarrassed by the volume of features you launch. You're like, there should be a long list of things you want to build afterwards. But I think when Reid Hoffman came out with that code and you built LinkedIn, that was back when UI didn't really look good, right? Designs didn't look good. I think the bit I disagree with is I do think your interface looking decent is actually quite important. It can be quite simple. It can be quite straightforward, but I think a tidy interface is important purely because we're now living in a digital world where there's a lot of competition for people's real estate on their phones and web browsers.
Yeah.
I think it's no longer, here's a product that doesn't look very nice, not very easy to use from a user experience perspective, but I expect there to be lots of user traction. I think that bit has changed from that kind of Reid Hoffman quote, but I think what hasn't changed is really getting out there with limited features. So if you're like, oh, it looks well, and it actually looks is less important, it can be very simple, but if the user experience is decent and it's easy for the user to engage with, and it's got limited features and you're a bit embarrassed by that, that's fine. But I think if you're like, oh gosh, it's impossible to use, it's not intuitive at all, I don't know if I should click here, etc., that's probably not a good thing because it's going to limit your traction.
Yeah, I think it's easy to use. I hope the user experience is quite good. It's more just, it needs a bit of work in terms of the UI kind of thing.
Polish.
Yeah, it needs to be polished. So yeah, thank you.
No.
Okay, so let's go with 2 more questions. And the next one is David.
Yes, it's just exactly as I asked in the chat, to be honest. So I'm in a similar position to some of the other founders there. I've done the MVP. I did the prioritization piece, and it sort of dictated early on that I had to leave out this really key feature that I thought would be the big hook. But I'm glad I've got the MVP out. I'm certainly not embarrassed by it. It does a job. But I find myself sort of describing to players and coaches, but yeah, wait until we do this great new hook. So I'd love to be able to sort of visualize that. So I suppose my question was, at the stage I'm at now, what's the best option to visualize that? I suppose it's going back to the UI guys and saying, look, can you just design this section of it and put it into a video, or
or a clickable prototype, right? So I actually find clickable prototypes quite interesting because you can create deep links based on certain hotspots, and actually testing them when you visualize them, I find quite useful, because if you, let's say, I don't know, you got a login screen, a prototype, and for whatever reason, someone's not clicked on the login bit, which has been linked to the next screen, you know that there is something wrong with that call to action. But actually just creating the screens and linking them, linking screens that you've created takes 5 minutes on any of the prototyping tools. And I think that's quite a good way of quickly testing at least the user experience, also seeing if the call to action is in the right place and will lead to that hook. But if you want to actually understand if that feature, there is demand for that, and you've already got a product out there, and you've got a community of users, I would try and get that feedback from the community of users.
Yeah, it's funny when you start getting into the build, you get into the detail of everything, and it's kind of founder advice to say always like write your vision on the wall or something. So when your busy to-do list takes over, you don't lose sight of the big reason why you did it. And I went back and read my original brief to the app developers, and I was like, how on earth did I let that one get deprioritized? What was I thinking?
Yeah.
So
it's a very interesting problem, right? So we are actually building a tool specifically to address this called Define, which actually Yana is running that project. But we found that it's so painful that founders will have a vision and the product is something else, not something else, but slightly different, and it's not necessarily aligned. And that problem is computers understand zeros and ones, and your vision is a gray area. And over time, that things get lost in translation. And actually, that's why I talked about impact mapping, etc. Somehow you need to always map in the dream scenario, we want to map every line of code that's written and kind of merged by a Bitbucket to your goal, right? Like there needs to be the line, the kind of, you need to join the dots between that. So we actually try to build something where we integrate the vision right through to Jira and Bitbucket. You can literally join the dots. It's really important to constantly go back to like, what is it that I wanted to deliver to the user as a utility and that hook, and make sure everything you're doing is aligned to that.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'd like to see that when you guys have done it. If I don't know how far off it is or anything, but then I was just curious about
the MVP version. We've got our MVP version.
Okay, there we go.
I'll be your first customer. And then I suppose what was the other one? I think, oh yeah. So I suppose there's a lot of founders in my position as well who literally do, as you guys were saying, do their product manager piece at the start, and then you've got to be your own accountant, you've got to be everything. Do you guys also offer that sort of product management side of it? So you've got, say, an interface like one of the guys, Jana or Ed, and then working direct. Those guys go off and work directly with the your developers, front end, back end, UI, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think big premise of our business was we realized that we needed to be interdisciplinary. So a lot of people be like, oh, I've got this freelance PM, I've got freelance UI designer, I've got a development agency here, etc. And you don't have that centralized accountability. So Jana, Ed, or any of the product managers act as that kind of basically centralized accountability. Everything is their responsibility, but then they liaise with the engineers and the designers, etc. But the idea is we still try and provide transparency. So let's say Jana or Ed are running a stand-up, client would come to that and so on. So we try and find that balance of providing transparency, but also having a product manager steering the ship in a way that PM can.
Yeah, and I'll probably dive in. I hope that answers your question, David. So we'll just take a last question, which I think is related to the question you just asked, David, as well, which is from Ganesh. Ganesh, are you there?
Oh yes.
So you had a question about testing app functionality.
Yes, thanks for that. Thanks, Ritam, for your explanations. I'm the founder of app development. I'm basically building an app from the third party. So the third party is building the app for us. So what we would like to know is they have built the product, and as a user, right, we would like to test the features. Right, it has enormous features, maybe 100+ features. So as a user, we would like to test the features, but it takes lots of time. So is there any automated way to test these features? So plug into your software and it will test all those features and then produce the results if it fails?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's things like Selenium. I'm not sure if Jana or Ed, you can remember what tools we use for automation, but there are loads of tools.
Okay.
Catalan Studio, we're using Catalan
Okay.
Studio. This is one of the we use as well.
What is that?
Yeah.
Catalan Studio.
Okay.
This is one. Yeah, there are like lots of automation tools out there that can help you to basically automate different like user scenarios. So basically you can create some sort of like a script that user do, and then with every build you can run through those scenarios that help you and save time in terms of like manual testing.
Okay. So is there any open source tools? Is it will cost for us, or it is freely available? I don't know.
I'm not sure. I don't know if that, I don't think the tools are that expensive actually, to be candid. I think the cost, I think Selenium is based on an open source framework as well, but generally the cost, if I'm candid, is writing the automated test script. That's the effort and time or cost element. And that's why it's much easier to have automation when your product's a bit stable and you're not constantly changing functionality. So we usually tend to use it for kind of regression testing, stuff that's there as part of the product already. There's also, the other thing I would recommend is you obviously need to test on lots of different devices, and there are loads of tools that allow you to do that without having a physical device. So there's like Amazon has something called Amazon Device Farm, etc., where you can kind of create use a virtual environment as well.
Okay. One more question. Sorry to add at the last minute. Is that something, the app which is built, right? It device dependent or the OS dependent. So let's say the device is maybe Samsung phone, and but it has Android version on it. So how whether the functionality differs from
so there's compatibility. So usually you will, when you're building an app, you will make sure that it is compatible with certain, it's usually based on operating system. So it'll go back to a certain number of versions of the operating system that you would support. So you would choose to support a certain set of operating systems, and by that also then devices.
So if you say operating system, it may be
okay. Ganesh, we're going to call it there, but just because I'm conscious that the people are finishing up now, and I just want to say a few final words. But yeah, I hope you'll agree that this is a fantastic session by Ritam and the team. Having been through this journey of building a dating app and rebuilding it, and having hired developers, sacked developers, outsourced, brought it back in. I can only say that I wish I'd met Ritam at the start of my journey and used him, because frankly, I think it would have been a lot quicker and our success would have been a lot easier. If any of you guys have any questions or want to discuss, like, Ritam and the team have said that they're happy to have a chat with you guys. So his email is there. Please do reach out. So yeah, so do reach out to those guys. And to say thanks to them, and thanks to all you guys for your great questions. Also, for any of you guys, if you're interested, we obviously run a number of different sessions. Please do reach out to myself as well on LinkedIn, or to Entrepreneurs Collective if you want to find out a little bit more about what we do. But again, thank you guys, and good luck with all your startups. I hope to be seeing them in the App Store very soon. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.